say this, a little more difficult this year. Hopefully once we get through the midterms, things will be a little bit better, but I would say apply more broadly. And again, recognize that your first job is not your last job. I mean, Patrick said he's been through 5 positions. He's on his 5th job. And hopefully for Patrick, 5th time's the charm. He'll be there forever. But your first job is not your last job. And so if you don't get exactly what you're looking for in this first go around, be optimistic that greener pastures are ahead. So my best advice is apply broadly. Patrick, I'm not sure if you have any other words of wisdom.
Yeah, I don't know. I would just reiterate that. Like, you can always dial back, right? If things are going really well and people offer you jobs, and um you can start pulling back, but it's harder to ramp up late in the process. I think broadly is good. Um and yeah, my case, my being near my family was my priority, and there were no academic jobs. And each of my job hops made me more academic till I'm here, and I'm hoping I stay for quite a while because I really like it. But yeah.
I think the only thing I would add to that is I do believe it's going to require some increased flexibility on the job search part, whether that's starting to apply broadly, like Heather was saying, or whether it's being a little bit more flexible in our list of priorities of what we are willing to take on or do as part of our job outside of training. And what I mean by that is a lot of us have been counseled or mentored previously to have a particular vision or niche in mind. And I think it's completely valid to still have that niche and explain what your ideal job would look like when you're on the job search. But I do think it will require that, although this is what ideally I would like, I do have some flexibility in X, Y, and Z, and could also see myself doing X, Y, and Z. And I do think that your interviewers and your prospective employers they will be aware of the environment that we all find ourselves in, and will have some understanding of the current environment. Heather and Patrick, so continuing down this trend of our first question, what would you say to applicants who they have spent their career focusing on advocacy or health equity or DEI type scholarly and extracurricular events? Do you think that with all of the different institutional DEI changes coming down from government policy, that these applicants should consider changing their interests or hiding or rebranding somehow whenever they're applying to jobs?
I would suggest, public universities are going to have to comply more with legality within each state. But it doesn't mean that you can't apply for foundational support. The March of Dimes, I think, is going to become the new best friend of health equity researchers. I think looking to our MFM and OB colleagues and looking for some foundational support on that side is going to be useful. The NICHD may disappear in this current administration. So I think some federal funding that is focused on equity and disparities is going to become harder for sure. That being said, I think that it's such an important field. It's still worth pursuing. And there are ways to stay in advocacy and try to just ride out this current, political situation that we're in, because, the adults in the room will prevail and it's going to get better. So I would say, I think it would be harder in public institutions, easier in private institutions, and you're going to have to get creative with foundational funding. If your equity work needs support, financial support. If you're doing, QI focused health equity, wonderful. That doesn't need foundational support. So there are ways to continue to be an awesome advocate or pursue equity work that doesn't even require financial support. So I would say, as Nicole said, be flexible, be creative. This is the time where we pivot and persist, right? We don't pivot and hide. So just be creative.
Yeah, I would agree with Heather. I think maybe I would broaden it. I think researchers are going to have a harder time finding positions where they're initially have a startup package that's significant, and that supports a large chunk of their time. I think that some of the people most interested in research probably will have to be a little bit more flexible for those first 2 years when it gets up and running, which will be harder on them. And then for advocacy, social determinants of health work, I think it's really critical we do it. And I think that it will be harder to be funded, but I think it's actually, I think the people are still interested in doing it and should.
Excellent. Dr. Myers, a question for you. You mentioned that you progressively got more academic with each new career. How did you portray that you were interested in academics during job interviews if you were coming from an institution that was not as heavily focused on academic medicine?
I came from institutions that had no academic requirement. You got to hustle is the bottom line. I volunteered to do every and any random research project that anybody would let me do. And I volunteered to do any lecture for the U of C fellows or residents that nobody else wanted to do. Sexual determinants of health, sexual health differentiation, would love to give that talk. Sodium, absolutely. Totally excited about sodium, and so it's one, networking, and so people know that you're still interested in being academic and being honest. Like, my wife's the much more academic partner, neonatologist. And I made it clear that while I wanted to be academic, that was my priority. And I would be grateful for any opportunities. And the community is small, and I think people are willing to try, but you have to reciprocate by putting in the time in. So, some nights and weekends where I wanted to do something else, I learned a lot about sodium, right? That's just the way it goes.
Excellent. Heather or Patrick, any thoughts on the use of recruiters or recruiting agencies?
I'll start. Um, it can be useful, but be careful. Um, the recruiters, so there, I think divide this into two distinct groups. Large groups like Kaiser will have people that are their main HR recruiters, right? That are your intake into those systems. And that's probably fine, though I would talk to local leadership about those opportunities. There are companies that recruit for hospitals. And what is tricky about them is that if you use them to look for jobs, and they put you in touch with a job that doesn't hire you, you are often precluded from applying to that job for X amount of years, 3 to 5, maybe even longer. And so it can, if you really, let's say, need to be in the North Carolina market, and you use the recruiter that has the contacts in North Carolina, and for whatever reason it doesn't work out, you go somewhere else, the job closes, you may be not eligible, that hospital may not be eligible to hire you because of the contract they signed with the recruiter. So I would just say, people, you need to do what you need to do to get a job, but also just be aware that it becomes much more complicated. I would definitely talk to your program leadership and maybe even section chief about how this works, because you should be forewarned about possible long-term consequences or benefits about that.
Excellent. To either Patrick or Heather, How would you summarize that a cover letter differs between academics versus private practice?
If you're applying for academics, you need to fill a niche in academia, right? We all have the things that we pursue in academics separate from our clinical work. And so you need to, one, figure out what niche you're hoping to fill at that institution. Hopefully, it's a niche that isn't already saturated with talent. And, you're going to like show why you are ready to kind of jump into that particular area. You need to, again, you use your CV as the kind of proof of your past accomplishments that prepare you well for that particular position. In academics, they are, you're on a faculty track and they don't want to hire someone onto a faculty track that doesn't have the potential to succeed. So you do need to have a demonstrable track record that you are going to, with the right resources and the right supports around you, accomplish, your short and long-term career goals. Again, those can be totally flexible over time, but really need to demonstrate in that cover letter what you've done and why you think you're prepared for this next step. In a community letter, if you're applying for a more, community type practice, like you're not expected to fill an academic role. Now, you might have to do things like fill out their the Vaughan database for as a good citizen of the group, but really a private practice group is going to be more focused on your clinical skills, and, like areas of clinical independence. For instance, smaller private practices, you might be the only pediatrician in the hospital. And so you need to really, be able to demonstrate clinical excellence and, teamwork. Like that's really important. If you're working in a small group, a private practice of 6 people, how can you demonstrate that you get along with interprofessional groups and other members of a team? Your CV, your cover letter really wants to focus on areas of community building, teamwork, and your clinical skills. So that's how I would separate the two. Patrick, any?
Yeah, just my only add-ons would be, what can you provide for the private practice group, right? Like what skills? Like I did some scheduling, I worked on QI initiatives, I was on collaborative care committees. And then how can you pivot your research to be useful to the group, right? They're not expecting you to publish in New England. What they're really expecting is, my nutrition research. Do you have a nutrition committee that I could sit on? Because I did nutrition research. That's part of my life is ending, but I really enjoy and like thinking about this and have some expertise in these fields. So like, how can you pitch what you already have to be useful to them? And then the biggest thing that private practice groups is they just don't want to babysit you. So you have to strongly focus on the fact that you are independent and competent.
Excellent. In regards to the job search timeline, when does, and I know we're going to have a whole webinar on negotiation, but when generally does negotiations begin? Before or after the offer letter?
Tricky. Heather, you want to go? Um, I'm actually not great at this. My wife is amazing at this, so I've learned a lot. Um, but I would say that some point between the first interview and during the second interview, often section chiefs will sit down with you, often multiple times during the second interview to kind of get a feel of what they are hoping to get from you and what they expect depending on the type of offer letter you get. If it's very detailed, you can ask them to modify the offer letter. And then that is often email, occasionally a Zoom call. So I would say somewhere between second interview to when you return the offer letter.
I think particularly for the next year or so, negotiations are going to be very difficult. I think salary negotiations are really going to be very limited. I think I would use the AAMC data about neonatology no, this is just for academics. Private practice is separate, but for academic positions, depending on, Southeast, Northeast, Midwest, West, use that as like your guide for what to expect in terms of your salary. But salary, I think, even in private practice, is going to be difficult to negotiate given cuts to Medicaid and 50% of practices cash flow comes from Medicaid. So I think that's going to be pretty tough. In terms of when to negotiate, you can start talking through specifics. Like I would say, even in the kind of second job interview day, if you get brought back for a second interview, I think the things that you may have more success negotiating, in this particular financial landscape is maybe the location of where you're doing your service time and call. If your group covers multiple units, you might be able to negotiate, faculty tuition benefits if you are looking to get a degree or a certificate that would ultimately benefit your group. But I think the negotiations are going to be a little tricky this go around. And so you can shoot for the moon, but just don't expect it, is what I would say this go round.
Excellent. And then our very last question of the webinar series for today is, what have you seen be the biggest mistake an applicant has made on the job search?
I'm gonna say that not knowing what you want, like it turns into a a snowballing cluster when what you think you want is not actually what you want, and you start applying to and getting offers from places you don't actually want to go to, but not getting interviews from the people you want to, and then reconfiguring in Thanksgiving, and then reconfiguring in December or January, and then finally settling on something in February or March. Like the people who somehow what they wanted or what they imagined their life to be was not actually what they wanted what ultimately their hard line was. Those are the people who just it's painful to be part of, much less watch.
I've seen, the two biggest issues that I've encountered in my 12 plus years being in fellowship leadership is one, fellows not doing their homework in terms of really knowing the divisions that they're applying to. What is the culture like? Talk to the junior faculty in that group, talk to the trainees in that group, and if you can, if it's academic, and really understand whether or not this is a group that you want to be a part of. It's not just about prestige. You don't go there just for prestige. You go there because it's the right fit for you and your career. So trainees that have not done their homework well enough has come back to bite some of them. And then I think trainees that over negotiate doesn't work well, particularly in academics. Um, you know, you're all skilled and you all have value to your future employers, but having too much, like, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but confidence about what value you bring to your new division and sort of being demanding of protected time and demanding of, money, that doesn't go well for trainees, in their as they try to transition. It is a big turnoff for department chairs and division chiefs who are really looking to improve their culture. So know what your value is, but don't overinflate your value, is what I would say. You guys are incredible. You're well trained. And do you deserve a huge salary? You absolutely do. Are you going to get it realistically? No. So, yeah, those would be kind of the areas that I've seen people fall short in.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we're going to sound like broken records here, but I've seen a lot of freezing because we do a really bad job as individuals making time for ourselves to undertake things that are sometimes described as fluffy, such as self-reflection. But I really do think investing the time now when we're very early in that timeline to start thinking about what sort of career do I want within neonatology? Like, do I have to care for ECMO? I feel like everyone comes into fellowship interviews saying, does your program teach ECMO? Well, now kind of sit back. Do you need ECMO in your life? Do you need to see this particular type of disease process or pathophysiology? Is that important for you? How about the size of the unit, the acuity of the unit, the movement of the unit? Some of those questions we need to start kind of answering for ourselves. And then that's just the clinical aspect of it. So then let's talk about the extracurriculars or the scholarly aspect of it if you're pursuing academia. Again, like we mentioned at the beginning, only you can answer those questions. And I've seen a lot of fellows freeze when they get to the job search because they don't know and want some guidance, but we can help you self-reflect, but we can't answer those questions for you. Only you can. Thank you guys so much for submitting questions to us via the chat and prior to the webinar. Thank you, Patrick and Heather, for joining me today. Other questions that were submitted that maybe we did not get to, we have plenty of other sessions that are coming down the pipeline, such as the private practice academic job search webinar, the interviewing webinar, and of course the contract negotiation webinar. We get a lot of questions regarding culture or a location's culture or environment, and I highly recommend, I put this already in the chat, taking a look at the DEI session from a prior year, which the YouTube link is right here on the slide. And for those of you job hunting with a visa, we just 3 weeks ago finished a webinar on the job search with visa, so take a look at that resource. And I'll end with the top advice from fellows who previously underwent the job search who've shared that with us. Their top advice is to start early, to be persistent, do not be afraid to follow up on multiple times or to cold call or email, to use your social connections, but be cautious as they can make or break your job search. Identify what is most important to you prior to the job search. Apply widely and outside of your institution, even if you want to stay, as you don't know what's out there until you go looking. Consider both academic and private practice options. Update your CV regularly. Don't sign too soon. Be patient. Identify how you stand out and what you can bring to the institution or practice, and then keep an open mind and be flexible. I feel like that last bullet point is of utmost importance, especially now in the current environment that we see ourselves in. Thank you so much for your attention. Please don't forget to fill out an evaluation on this webinar and in this series, providing us feedback for anything that we can do better for you and your fellows that follow you in the future. Thank you.